Thank you, Anna. Well, it's a pleasure to be here, and I appreciate Altair's sponsoring this. It's terrific. So I guess I'd just like to begin by saying someone once said, there are no inheritance problems, only communication problems. Now, I do know some people who have been disinherited who might argue with that statement, but the fact is that most what we might call inheritance problems could either have been prevented or resolved through some better communication. And so this is what we're going to be talking about today. As you know, Anna and I worked diligently to put together a survey that many people in the audience kindly took online. If you didn't take the survey, you can leave now. No, just kidding. Actually, I'm going to report on some of the results of the survey, which I think are very interesting, and will provide an opportunity for us to discuss what we know are really some good practices for communication around transition of wealth from one generation to the next. I say good practices because sometimes people talk about best practices. And one of the things I would want to point out is whatever I say up here, if it doesn't fit for your family, it's not a best practice. So the idea here, I think, is to be thinking about what's possible, what makes sense, what might help, but to think that you have to do any of the things that we recommend or we talk about, that doesn't make sense if it doesn't fit for your family. So then I want to say one more thing, that when people talk about the transition of wealth from one generation to the next, when I talk to families about this, often the questions that people have are things like, what should we tell the kids, and how much should we tell the kids, and how much should we tell them about how much there is? Now, those are questions about quantity. And questions about quantity are actually, they need to come after questions about quality. So we don't begin by talking about how much and how much to share and when. Really, where we need to begin with conversations about transferring wealth from one generation to the next are questions about quality. So what do you want to accomplish with the wealth that you're transferring? What would you like to see happen for your kids who you are providing these gifts for? Those are the most important conversations, and often those are the conversations that are missed. So as we see, we'll talk more about that a little later, but I want to point that out at this point. So, okay, so I'm going to go through these slides pretty quickly. This is some of the demographics of people who responded to our survey. You have them all in your handouts. About half the people consider themselves wealth creators. About a third are both wealth creators and inheritors. And so we'll go on. So, okay, so the first question we asked, which is a very important question, is have you had detailed conversations about your family's wealth, either with your parents or with your adult children? So have you had these conversations? And what we find is about half the people have had the conversations and half have not had the conversations. So let me say just a couple of things about that. Most people are reluctant to talk about money. Most families, it's easier to talk about your private, I have to say, my background's as a psychologist, right? So as a psychologist, one of the things I used to find is that it's easier for people to talk about their private, intimate sex lives than it is to talk about money. And so we are reluctant in general to talk about money, but more so, and we'll see a little bit more of this a little later, but more so, we're reluctant to talk about how much money we might be transferring to the next generation because very often there are fears that if people have that information, it's going to take away, it's going to create attitudes of entitlement, it's going to take away any motivation to do things on your own and so on. So what we often end up doing, because we're concerned about not wanting to take away the incentive for people to to accomplish things on their own, so we don't talk about it. We don't talk about it at all. So we have no communication because we're afraid that if we have too much communication, we're going to undermine incentive. Well, there's a paradox there, because what ends up happening is if we have no communication, we actually stand a good chance of creating the very thing we're afraid of. Because if we don't provide information, if we don't provide opportunities for people to learn, if we don't provide opportunities for people to take real responsibility, then we are creating an opportunity to have our children become the very thing we're afraid of, which is uneducated as to wealth, unprepared as to handling it, and not being comfortable talking about it. So there's this paradox. We're afraid of talking about it, but if we don't talk about it, we create the things we're afraid of. So let's go to the next slide. So then we decided we were going to ask people, what are your greatest concerns about transitioning wealth to the next generation? And so we took all the answers and we kind of sorted them into a bunch of different themes. And so the first theme is concerns about good structure. So in other words, people were ensuring thoughtful estate planning, both tax minimization, providing enough structure, lack of clarity on future tax and estate laws. So these are concerns about structures. Someone actually said not fully understanding our family wealth structures. So here's the thing. The structures are very important. So the structures, when we say structures, what I refer to are the estate plan, having a family foundation, could be a family office, the trusts that we create, and so on. So the structures are very important. But I have to say that all too often, the structures are the tail that wag the transition dog. So the structures are the tail that wag the dog. In other words, it's not uncommon. So when I'm involved working with a family, I often get involved with families where there's conflict, there are problems around an inheritance, the family relationships are disrupted because of what people have done with the structures and so on. So I have to tell you that all too often these dilemmas that families face are created by the structures themselves. Because very often what we think about when we're transitioning wealth is not what's the purpose, what are the values, what do I want to see, what's my vision, but all too often the transition of wealth is actually driven by tax planning, almost primarily by tax planning. And so you can create structures that will minimize taxes, but there's no guarantee that those structures are actually going to be good for your family. Sometimes, for example, it's one of the structures that one might create provides for an inheritance, of course, after you're gone, right? But sometimes it makes sense to transfer some of that wealth earlier, when you're alive, when it's possible for the children to do something constructively with it when you're around. So that's just one example of how the structures need to be adapted to what's right for the family. So let's go to the next. So concerns about good timing, of course. So uncertainty as to the right time to pass parts or all of the wealth. Unsure what our wealth needs will be prior to passing. So these are absolutely make sense. These are very, very legitimate concerns. One of the things I would say, though, is that none of this has to be all or nothing. None of this has to happen all at once. So one of the things that I encourage people to think about is to think in terms of milestones in the life of a family or milestones in the life of the children. So at what point might it be appropriate to transfer some wealth to your kids? And based on what kind of criteria? So some families will actually have what I call rituals that welcome the children into sharing some responsibility for the wealth that might eventually be transferred to them. So to think about what are some of the milestones, what are some of the criteria that you are interested in developing in your children and basing some of the transfer on some of those milestones. So next, what are your greatest concerns about, again, transfer? Concerns about differences between children. Of course, the concern there is that, there are different children in the family, and they might have different needs, they have different skills, and so on. And so here, what I would say about concerns about differences between children is that the differences are real, the differences exist, and if you act like we are going to ignore the differences, then you may be creating an opportunity for conflict in the next generation if you don't recognize and don't discuss any of the differences that there are. We like to think that our kids are all the same, but they're not. And so one of the, let's say, takeaways that I think is important for everybody here in the room to be thinking about is how to tailor your transfers to who your kids are. And the best way to begin thinking about that is by talking to your kids. So one question, for example, that you'll see that I emphasize the value of family meetings. And so a question that you can use in a family meeting is, how can we as your parents best enhance your opportunities in life with the wealth that we'd like to transfer? You don't have to talk about dollars, you don't have to talk about amounts, but you can talk about goals, intentions, strengths, vision. And so by beginning to talk about that, you can begin to think about, well, what are the differences between our kids, and how should our transfer of wealth be tailored to that, if at all? Concerns about entitlement. Of course, this is the fundamental concern that most of us face when we talk about transferring wealth to the next generation. And again, as I said before, people often think that if we share too much information, we're going to create entitlement. But I got to tell you, it's not sharing information that creates entitlement. I know families where the kids have a great deal of information about the wealth the family has, about the wealth that they're likely to inherit. And those kids do not have these entitled attitudes with lack of incentive and so on. Information on its own does not create entitlement. I have to say, it's parenting that creates entitlement. Right? It's parenting. So some parents will not want to share information with their kids about how much money there is and how much they may be likely to inherit. And so one of the things that they do is, rather than share the information, the parents will try to control the information, but then take care of all of the kids' needs. Like, okay, you don't have to worry about, Mom and Dad, I'd like to know, is there going to be money for my kids' college education? This is a question that I've seen, And I've seen the response being, you don't have to worry about that. Okay, so you don't have to worry about that. So is that a good response? Is that a response that's going to develop the kids in a productive way? Or is that a response that's just going to somehow continue this or promote this attitude of entitlement? Right? So the information on its own is not what's destructive. Right? And so there has to be a certain amount of self-awareness as to how we're raising our kids and what kind of information we should be providing and when. So greatest concerns concerns about good stewardship, passing on the same values of wealth preservation and philanthropy that were taught to me. So these are concerns about stewardship, that how can we pass on the values that are important to us as wealth creators? Well, I got to tell you, passing on values is not a one-way street. It's a two-way street. So it's not on, if you want good stewardship in the family, it's not just saying, these are the values that you should absorb from me. It's also talking with your kids about what their values are. It's a two-way street. And then finally, concerns about good communication. And that's exactly what we're talking about now, that people often avoid communication, thinking that sharing information is going to undermine incentive, when it's really, that's not the case, that providing information in a staged way based on the developmental level of the kids, based on who you are as parents, based on your vision as to what you'd like to accomplish with the wealth, those are the important elements of communication. So then, any questions, any comments about that? I mean, I don't want to be just standing here and shouting at you this whole time. Any thoughts, any questions? No? Yes? Yes?
You alluded to when is the right time, and you talked a little bit about that. As a researcher, as a PhD, as a psychologist, what does the research say? When is the right time? Between your 20s and 30s, between your 30s and 40s? When?
Okay, so that's a good question. When is the right time? And so the right time to begin talking about values, because that's what I'm...
The right time to begin talking about
To be talking about
transfer of wealth.
the transfer of wealth. There's no one right time. I can say that most people consider an actual transfer to be appropriate around between probably in mid-30s, something like that, of significant wealth. However, one of the things I would say is that, and I'll talk about this a little later, that it's a good idea to think about making some transfers earlier on so that kids have some responsibility and they learn to take some responsibility. So that it's not like at 35, all of a sudden I inherit, all this, or all of a sudden I learn about what's there. It's not a bad idea to provide some funds earlier on so that the kids can actually learn how to manage something. So one of the things, a mantra that I like is that in order to be responsible, you have to have something to be responsible for. So it's one thing to say, I want my kids to have responsibility. Well, there needs to be something they're responsible for. So, I got a call from someone who was a CEO of a family office one time, and she said, we're having problems with the next generation. I said, well, what's the problems? Well, they're all in their late 20s, and they're spending money like crazy, and they're going to end up spending beyond their means. I said, okay, so it's a family office, yes. I said, well, are there any committees or anything that these kids can serve on? Well, no, not really. Is there any family philanthropy that they can be involved in? Well, no, not really. Is there an investment committee or something where they can learn? No, not really. I said, so the only thing that really these kids can do is spend money. She said, yeah. I said, okay, so they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. So there needs to be so I don't want to make it that there's a black and white mark. And then the other thing I want to say is that I really want to encourage you to be thinking not on the quantity side, but to be thinking on the quality side, meaning the earlier discussions need to be about what's our vision as parents, that what do we want this money to do for you? And to ask the kids, what do we want, what do you want? What makes sense to you? How can we enhance your lives? So however you do it, whether it's through one-on-one conversations with kids or whether you have some regular family meetings, which I would definitely recommend, however you do it, not talking about the dollars, but talking about the values, the goals, the vision, all of that. And there are exercises that you can do to help promote that in the family, which we're not at that level of detail here today, but there are some things that you can do like that. Does that all answer the question? Okay. Okay, so then we had a question, what worries you the most about you or your children inheriting money, and then worries about entitlement, which we've already talked about, and then worries about conflict and collaboration. So again, what I want to say that because people worry about entitlement, they tend to withhold information. But it's the withholding of information that actually will create these attitudes of entitlement. So figuring out how to share the right information at the right time is really critical. Okay, so let's go to, so as I said, look, there are some like good practices that we know are helpful for families when they're thinking of transitioning wealth from one generation to the next. Again, I say good practices because if it doesn't work for your family, it's not a best practice, it could be a worst practice. But there are some things that we know are really helpful for families to do. So we asked people, how many of you have done these things? So here's some of the statistics, okay, some of what we learned. And by the way, I've done almost similar surveys with other groups, and these numbers are not terribly different than the other groups that I've seen. So, okay, so adult children have been told how much they're likely to inherit, 21%. So now, of course, we don't know the ages and so on, but I would say eventually it's a good thing for people to know what they're in line for so that they can build their lives in appropriate ways, not necessarily based on what they're going to inherit, but being able to take that into some consideration. Yes, question? I'm sorry, say this again? Yes. Just this group. About 30. About 30. So that's actually, it's a nice number. So family is met to discuss the values that guide their financial decisions, such as spending, inheritance, financial gifts, philanthropic giving, and investing. About a third. Now, I would say that's one of the most important steps that a family can take is, again, it's not talking about numbers, but it's talking about what are the values that underlie the decisions, the financial decisions we make. Sometimes people ask, well, at what point should we start, having these conversations? It's not too early to start having these conversations when people are in adolescence, to start talking about values. Why do we live where we live? Why do we practice what kind of philanthropy do we practice and why? So to begin some of these discussions in adolescence is not too soon. Okay, next question was, families developed a written statement that documents their values and wishes. So about a quarter of people have done that. Actually, that surprises me that there are that many, because often when I talk to groups, that documentation tends not to occur. But really, having something like, some families would call this a family charter, or a family mission statement, or a family vision statement, where you actually sit together and you create something that is written that reflects the values that are important to you as a family. Sometimes I've had people sometimes call me and say, well, we'd like a family mission statement. Can you send us one? And, well, I can, but the real value is not in that document, it's not in the written thing. It's in the process that you go through as a family to create that. I've also had one family I worked with once where I asked, do you have a family, mission statement or family constitution? Oh, yes. And so there was, I was working with that because there were some problems, there was conflict in the family. I said, oh, so you have this constitution? Yes. Okay, does, everybody buy into it? Well, no, not really. Well, why not? Well, because Dad and his lawyers wrote the Constitution, and then he gave it to us to sign. And the problem was, and this is an interesting situation. Listen, I'm not, I know I'm, it's a little humorous, but, they say humor is tragedy plus time. So here, looking back, we can say it's funny. It wasn't funny when it was happening. So in this situation, it's true that Dad and his lawyers, they created a constitution. And here, I'm saying that, well, developing a written statement is a good thing because it actually, the process is good. It can bring people together. It provides an opportunity to talk about your values and so on. Well, in this situation, they created a constitution. Of course, the goal was to bring the family together and to create something good. Well, it actually tore the family apart. But it wasn't the Constitution that tore the family apart. It was the process of saying, we're creating something, now you have to sign it. So they didn't get buy-in. So you can create a process that allows for people to have buy-in, to contribute, so that their voice can be heard, so that the values are not just one-sided, but they go two ways. Next, parents' estate plan has been discussed with adult children, about a third. Okay, so this is good. At some point, I have a term I call planning in a vacuum. So often we create these structures that are either for the benefit or the detriment of people in the family, and we create these structures without ever talking to people about, the impact the structure is going to have on them. And so I call that planning in a vacuum. So the one thing I can tell you is that you can create the structures, you can create the plans, and you could do all of that, and the plans could make sense from a legal point of view, but if any part of the plan requires some buy-in from the people who are involved. So, I worked with a family where one of the structures they created was a foundation. And having a foundation, practicing family philanthropy is great because it really brings family together to discuss values and to work together on something that's going to benefit the world. So that's a great thing. But in this family, they created a foundation, and the foundation was based 100% on mom and dad's values, which frankly were a little different than their kids' values, 100%. And mom and dad were like, it has to be based on these values. There's no flexibility. Well, here again, you have a good structure that is creating dissent in the family. The foundation requires buy-in. And if you want buy-in, then you need to include these beneficiaries in some of the planning. Not all of it, but some. So again, if what you want is buy-in, then there needs to be some back and forth. Again, the timing, I can't say, well, at age 29, this is exactly what you should do, but again, you think about it as a process that occurs over time. Philanthropic intent has been discussed as a family. Okay, I already talked about that in terms of foundation. Funds provided to adult children to invest or manage on their own. So close to half of people have done some of that, which is a good thing. Again, I think one of the things I would emphasize is that if what you want to see is people taking responsibility, there needs to be something for them to take responsibility of. There needs to be something for them to be responsible for in order to learn responsibility. So it's good practice to consider how to transfer some wealth to kids earlier than perhaps you might already be thinking of. Adult children have met trustees of trusts. Okay, about a third. Well, so here's the thing. Often the trusts are created and trustees are selected, and the trustees often think that their main role in the life of the trust or the life of the family is to learn how to say no. That's often the role that the people think, that the trustees think, that what they're supposed to do is say no. Well, that's one way of, thinking about a trustee, but really the best role for a trustee is to take on some of the kind of responsibilities that I've been talking about here. That the trustees are in an amazing position to educate, to develop, to engage with the next generation, to help them take responsibility, take appropriate responsibility. And the trustees are not enmeshed in any of the family dynamics that, the families are involved in. So, but this requires, talking to trustees, having good communication with the trustees so that they understand what's expected, what's appropriate, what's proper, and what makes sense for the family. So if the trustees only see that their role is to say no to the kids, then that's what you'll get. But if you begin a process of kind of development and education on all sides, the trustees can have an amazingly positive role. So families provide adult children financial literacy and learning opportunities. So here's there are courses and there are opportunities for the next generation to learn about finance, to learn about economics, to learn about managing money and so on. And sometimes we think that if we're good at doing it, then our just by inheritance, our kids are going to inherit the genes that are not necessarily the case, though. So providing opportunities, and trustees can do that. Altair has programs on this that provide education for next generation family members. So taking advantage of that is really a good thing. Yes?
What's your opinion on having trustees as family members or non-family members?
Well, people want family members as trustees because they trust them, right? Because they trust them, and often because even though this is perhaps not appropriate, because there's a sense that they can control them. The wealth creators like family members to be trustees because they trust them, but also in a sense because they can control them. I think probably the more important matter is the trustee someone who is capable to the job that is required? So whether it's J.P. Morgan or whether it's a family member, I think there needs to be, there could be, in the best of all possible worlds, it's a good thing to have good conversations with the trustees to help think about what is it I want the trustee to do? And then to begin kind of developing that or tailoring that in working with the trustee. I think if your kids are old enough for them to be somehow part of that as well. The problem with family members, and I've seen this, is either they're too willing to do exactly what the wealth creators have said, and while that's, in a sense that's their role, the wealth creator is not always, sometimes the wealth creator says, the most important thing is preserving the money. That's the most important thing. We have to make sure the money is here for generation after generation after generation. And I would say that, part of the role of probably the wealth creator and maybe, other parties is to say why. Really, what's the purpose here? It's great for it to grow, but what do you want to do with it? Sometimes I think that it's the family is sitting around a table and everybody has a seat at the table, including the money. And sometimes it's the money that has the loudest voice. You have to preserve me. You have to grow me. And so I just think it's a good thing to say why. What do we want to accomplish? And so having some of that conversation with the trustees is probably a good thing. So in my view, it's rather than saying, well, should it be a corporate trustee or should it be a family member? I think asking what's the job that you really want this person to perform, and then having some dialogue around what that is. Yes?
I might add, I think it has to do with the culture of the family too, and sort of where they are in the process of the wealth creation. It might be a different conversation in a first generation wealth creation versus a multi-generational situation. And the opportunity for the family to create education. How do you be a trustee? I mean, that's one of the processes we go through in our family is what is a trustee, what are your responsibilities, and then how do we train you to be a good trustee?
Absolutely, that's great, that's good. So if there's going to be a family member, actually ensuring that the family member has some education, a background, and so on. Okay, so let's see, okay, let's go to the next slide. Okay. In your opinion, with regard to passing wealth on to adult children, is it better to be fair or equal? So you can see about equal numbers said fair and equal, and equal numbers say it depends. Is there a right answer? Probably, it depends. But the thing is, look, there's some comments about this. Some people said the definition of fair varies by person. Yes. Passing on wealth is an emotional event, so make it equal. Equal can, in a sense, takes away some of the emotion because you're going to be based it just on what the numbers are. Circumstances change over time. What's considered fair now could change. Depends on the situation. When adult, make it equal. Medical and mental health needs should be considered. Of course, that's good. So listen, there's really no one answer to this. But it is a question that deserves consideration. And it depends on what's being passed on. So it's one thing to say, if what's being passed on is simply dollars, that's one thing. But if a business is being passed on, then there are different implications of that. So if we say, one of the things I've seen is that there are, often challenges come when a business is passed on in equal shares to the next generation, but only some of those parties are actually actively working in the business. So sometimes people say, well, in that case, the ones who are working in the business should have 100% ownership. So that's like saying it's fair, right? Because it's based on some sense that because they're working in the business, they deserve that kind of ownership. But again, I'm not giving you any answers. I'm giving you the dilemmas. However, I've also seen that in situations like that, if you have people who haven't worked in the business, it doesn't mean that they have no connection to the business. It doesn't mean that they have no love of the business. And it doesn't mean that there won't be conflict or disturbance because those people who feel that, so I worked with one family where you had one son who was active in the business and he did a fantastic job. He grew the company exponentially. He was very, very successful. And the parents decided in the course of their estate planning that he should have 100% of the company. Well, it's a lovely family with really, really good values, but the other children, there were 3 others, who felt completely cut out of what they felt was part of their inheritance and part of their legacy, because they had grown up with this business, they had worked in it, summers and so on, and they had been told by their parents, don't depend on the business, go out and have careers. So in a sense, they did exactly what the parents suggested, and then they got cut out of something that they felt was a part of their family. Well, this was a very, very special family, I have to say this, that not every family is like this. Well, and there was difficulty in this family for 10 years, honestly. There's just this thing, and they couldn't resolve it. And finally, they had some discussions, and I worked with them and so on. And the brother who's in the business said, if it's going to help this family, and this is very, very unique and very rare, if it's going to help the family, I will pass on some ownership to my siblings. I want them to have some ownership because I understand that that's important to them. And he spent a year figuring out how to do that, working with his accountants and lawyers and so on. And today I can say they're in a very different position than they were before, but that's very unique. So what's right? Is it equal? Should we do it equal? Should we do it fair? You can't do it just off the top of your head. There has to be some communication, some dialogue, some seeking, asking, finding out, what do the kids want? You don't have to decide entirely based on what the kids want, but you can have some of those conversations. Okay, so let's go on. In your opinion, how well prepared are inheritors? So 14% said they're well prepared. Over half said they're somewhat prepared, and 14% not at all. So I would say one thing, it's not too late. It's not too late to begin a process of preparation. And preparation, it has to be an interactive process of mutual education and mutual dialogue. To what extent have inheritors been told the level of family wealth? So fully informed, 7%, partially informed, almost 3/4, not at all, about 1/5. So here's the thing. you know, again, you know, we're talking about sharing information. The thing is, even if you share nothing, even if you directly share no information with your kids, they already know a great deal. They already know a great deal. And that's one of the, I think one of the challenges and one of the differences that we face in today. It has to do with, you know, Thomas Friedman wrote this book a while ago, The World is Flat, and we just see that more and more, right? That there's information is available now in ways that totally was not available before. So whereas 50 years ago, it was possible for someone to kind of make an estate plan and control all the information, it was possible for someone to control all the information, and with that control of information comes power. Today, it's much more difficult to do that, to control all the information. And so your kids can go online, right? And they can find out, what did you pay for the house? That's easy, they can find that out. They can find out what the neighbors paid. They know how much the cars cost. And I'm not talking about, you know, I'm not talking about adults. I'm talking about adolescents, you know, or even younger. They have that information. So is it better for them to have the information and for just to be there like in some kind of unstructured way? Or is it better for you to try and take it in hand and guide them as to what the information means, how to use it, what are the implications, and so on? Okay, so if your family is not fully disclosed, why? So almost 2/3 say because they're concerned about negative implications. You know, work ethic, entitlement, and so on, all the stuff we've been talking about. So people, this kind of supports what I was saying before, that the reason we don't communicate is because we're concerned about entitlement. And that pattern I've seen in many other times with groups, that the reason we don't communicate is because we're concerned about entitlement. And again, anytime, you know, now, okay, I speak as a psychologist, but anytime behavior is driven by fear, you actually run the risk of creating the very thing you're afraid of. And I'll give you a very, very simple example. If you're afraid of heights and you never look over the edge, right? So you always back off. So that behavior is driven by fear. The only thing you're doing as you back off is you're strengthening the fear, because you're never really standing there and saying, okay, I can do this, I can tolerate it, and so on. You're always backing off. You're just reinforcing the fear. And so this is my observation. I don't know, you know, I'm talking as a psychologist, that anytime behavior is driven by fear, you run the risk of creating the very thing you're afraid of. So culture, we never talk about money in our family. That surprised me because, you know, only like 10% said we never talk about money. Many families are very reluctant to talk about money. Privacy concerns, 10%. Inheritors are not old enough. Okay. So a third of people said inheritors are not old enough. That's perfectly fine. It's acceptable to me. I don't have a problem with that, as long as the inheritors are like under 50. I guess, something like that. I think you get the message. I'm not sure I said it right, but that's the message. I mean, you know, if you say, well, the inheritors are, yes, sir. When do they talk to them about money?
In other words, we have, I don't know, imagine we have a wide range of, you know, families in here with some kids that are,
Yeah.
you know, let's say they're over 30.
Yeah.
We got some.
So,
You know, we got some, I got a kid that's 17. So I'd really be interested in terms of, you know, when do people talk to them?
so okay, so I can tell you that, so the question is, when do people actually talk about the money? You know, it's hard, I wish I could say, it's hard to give a definitive answer. I can say, if we go actually to the next slide, I think. So at what age do you believe the adult children in your family have or will have achieved maturity? So what you see, and this is almost always what I see when I ask these questions, is between the ages of 26 and 45, most people feel that there's a level of maturity to actually have something about the numbers. But again, what I want to say is, for example, you said you have a 17-year-old son. It's not too early to begin talking to a 17-year-old son about values that underlie some of the gifts you want to make to him. So it may be too early to talk about the dollars, but it's not too early to talk about the values. I recently met with a family where they have a family office, and they have, it did surprise me, they have no process around how they introduce their kids to the wealth that is governed in this family office. No process at all. Well, they have one element in a process, and what is that? At age 21, the CEO of the family office sits with the child and says, this is how much you're going to be getting over the next X number of years. You're going to get distributions on a monthly basis, blah, 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 and gives them some idea of how much money there is out there eventually that this person might inherit. At age 21, no other preparation, no discussion of values, no discussion of what, in this case, it was grandma and grandpa, what they want to accomplish by providing these gifts to their kids. So it's providing some information in a complete vacuum. And so my guess is that at least some of these kids will end up being a big disappointment to their grandparents and to their parents because they're being introduced to the numbers without any preparation beforehand. So let's go, and we're almost, in your opinion, should in-laws, okay, and I think this is our last slide, so timing is good. Should in-laws be included? So about a third say yes, and about a third say no. And here's the thing about in-laws being included. They're going to be included one way or another. They're going to have the information one way or another. So number one is they're going to have information one way or the other. Number two is, so three things. One is they're going to have the information one way or the other. Two, every family begins with an in-law. Every family begins with an in-law. So it's not like in-laws somehow, they don't, every family begins with an in-law. And number three is, can't remember what number three is. They should be, every family begins with an in-law. They're gonna get the information one way or another. Oh, the in-law is the parent of the child. And so if you want the children, that next generation, to be properly engaged in some processes, you want the support of both parents. I know I haven't said too many definitive things here today. A lot of it is depends. I would say that including in-laws is probably not a just depends. That's a good thing. And finding a way to do it appropriately, properly, through, some families I know have a process for onboarding in-laws so that they really understand what there is. Of course, this leads to discussion of prenuptial agreements, which we could probably do a whole day on at some point. But in any case, so I think that's the last slide. Yes?
I have a question about either talking to people about financial literacy or values. A lot of people, I hear a lot of people say, they don't care. My family doesn't care. Or I have a child who's just not interested and I can't get them to engage. What advice do you give to families who are concerned about the next generation who's not?
Okay, so that's a great question, and I have to say, look, it's like everything we do education-wise. If we plan an education, an instructional event or an opportunity, and we don't take into consideration what's interesting or engaging or exciting for the people who are participating, they're going to be bored, they're going to be uninterested. So of course, look, I've worked with many families where they say, where they've had family meetings, and the family meetings have been, nobody likes them. They're unpleasant. Okay, well, why are they unpleasant? Well, the CFO of the company comes in and he does all the numbers. And we don't understand anything about these numbers. There's a lot of jargon. And by the way, I'm sitting there with my cousins, and I don't want them to know how stupid I am, so I don't understand any of this stuff, so I'm not going to ask any questions. So these are very unpleasant experiences. So at the same time, I've worked with families where they create something that's fun and engaging. So it depends on, how old the kids are. If they're spending, if they have to spend 4 hours talking to, I hope no one, talking to an accountant, I know that's 4 hours. I hope there are no accountants in the room. Spending, 4 hours talking to an accountant, that's going to be miserable. But, oh, so there are a few accountants. Okay, okay, let me put that differently. Let me say this. If they spend 4 hours talking to a very boring accountant, then that'll be miserable. I'm sorry. Yeah, so, but if one of the things they do is they do a site visit to one of the, part of the company, or if they go to, if they go have lunch with Anna. I mean, that'd be, and have her explain some things. That'd be great. It's, tailoring it. Anyhow, but so I'm sorry. It's that. I don't know if that explains it, but tailoring it. Yes.
I want to go back to the variability in the kids, especially around financial literacy and sibling rivalry. How do you counter when there's variability in the siblings of skill level? How do you counter the jealousy, the anger, to where they want to stay engaged, but they're not competing for mom or dad's favor or somebody else?
Okay. So Peter, you're going to be up on the stage a little later, right?
Yes.
Okay. I'd like to hear your answers to that. No.
Well, I think that this is a real issue.
Yeah.
Because the variability is there, and it's like, oh, go off, kids, let's get you financially literate, right?
So, okay, that's a great question, obviously. I can tell you that the differences lead to conflict if we pretend they're not there. If we say, our kids are all equal, they're all the same, that's when there's conflict. So I worked with one family where mom would say, so everything had to be equal. Everything had to be equal. Mom would say when the kids were growing up, if one got a bicycle, the others had to get a bicycle also. I said, well, what if they didn't need a bicycle? Doesn't matter. If one had a bicycle, they all have to have a bicycle. So pretending, because that's what it is, pretending that everything is equal, exactly equal, creates, in that family, what happened is it caused, I think, again, speaking as a psychologist, one of the things that did was it caused people to pay more attention to what this one's getting and this one's getting and this one's getting, rather than being a culture in the family that says there's enough for everyone and everyone will have their needs served as life goes on. There's enough. Saying everything has to be equal is actually saying there's really not enough and you have to pay attention and make sure that your brother doesn't get more than you. So I know that doesn't really answer the question, but it's a very good question. Yes?
Can you go back to slide 15? There's just something on there that sparked my interest in a comment. It's on the
Okay, slide 15.
down below about concerns that sharing the information could lead. Sorry,
No,
concerns. The next one over.
next one.
My pages are
Oh, concerns that this information will have negative implication?
conflict. And I
Oh.
find that very interesting because, again, it's addressing what you just said. Is if you don't want to face the reality, well, then that conflict's going to happen later down the road when you're not there to talk about your values and everything else that you are intending to accomplish when you transfer wealth. So that's a really interesting statistic.
Yeah. Yeah.
To avoid it because you're afraid it's going to lead to conflict means you're just pushing conflict.
So I worked with one family where dad was the founder, dad's estate plan. Nobody knew this until they were sitting, this is what I was told, they were sitting in Manhattan in the lawyer's office, and the lawyer's reading the will, and the brother got all the control, got 100% control of this business. His sisters inherited some shares in the company, but absolutely no control. Nobody knew this. Nobody knew this was happening, including the brother. Nobody knew this was going to happen until they're sitting in the lawyer's office. Well, Dad did a disservice, I have to say, did a disservice, because he was afraid, right? He didn't want to deal with the conflict, while he's living, so he figured, okay, well, when I'm dead, maybe it won't bother me so much. But yeah, so again, if we avoid talking about it, doesn't make it go away. So, okay, so I think we did the last slide. Oops, let me, geez. Yeah, right, this is stuff I wanted to say. Okay, give me 2 minutes. So, key elements of family wealth continuity, and I think I've emphasized most of these. Values, vision, and purpose. So if what you want is to successfully transfer wealth to the next generation, there needs to be some communication and conversation and understanding and self-awareness as to why you're doing it. That's number one. Number two is have family meetings and family discussions that address these issues. There are ways to do it. You can talk to, I know Anna's, really works with families to do some of that, on how to set agendas and so on. Personal development. Again, if you're just leaving the money to the kids without providing any preparation, that's not a good thing. So this financial literacy, visits to the business, understanding what is in the trusts. Very often people have trusts that have been created that they're one of the most important things in their lives, and they don't understand what's in there. So spending some time with some of the lawyers to go over that, I consider that personal development. I said rituals, milestones, and rites of passage. Deciding that it's not all or nothing, that things develop over time, that yes, at age 21, you might want to sit down with someone and say, so here are some of the distributions that would be coming your way. But before that, you might want to talk about what are distributions, or you might want to talk about how was the business developed, and so on. Responsibility. You need to have something to be responsible for if you're going to take responsibility. And finally, I want to say freedom. And again, I think we can spend a whole day on freedom. The money, listen, money is a good thing in the life of a family. But if money is a way of controlling people, and so sometimes I ask people, so what's the greatest gift this wealth can provide in your family? And very often the answer is, the greatest gift is freedom. That what money allows you to do is to have freedom to make good choices. But if the structures you create tie people up so that they have no freedom, so they have to be partners for the rest of their life with cousins that they might not know or might not want to be partners with, or partners with siblings who they never got along with, and mom and dad's fantasy that somehow because they're going to share this trust that somehow they'll finally get along. That's a fantasy, and that's not freedom. So considering the role, what role how to promote freedom is a good thing. And one more slide, I know. So further, not too much too soon in terms of transferring the wealth. Plan your giving with reference to the guiding vision. I said these principles, values, and so on. Don't let the tax tail wag the estate plan dog. Just because it's good for tax planning doesn't mean it's good for your family. Discuss the purpose of the wealth. Discuss and share these values and revise them over time. This could be part of an ongoing process. And then finally, consider how the money can be used to achieve guiding vision and to enhance, not to enable what emerges. So the difference between enhancement and enabling, what I would say, is enhancing supports something that's already there. Enhancing, using money to enhance someone's life is using the money to support something that's there. Enabling is using money to try and create something that isn't there at all. So, and with that, I will say thank you, and thank you very much.